Madam Secretary. You just bailed out two banks and or three banks, and you've made their depositors whole. Uh, am I to understand that if you do the same thing here, or if the same thing happens to one of our regional banks in the state of Oklahoma, will our depositors be bailed out the same way that the folks were at Silicon Valley Bank or
Right.
Signature Bank? And she said, no, that's not the case. She said the it has to be an uber decision, an uber majority decision by the FOMC, which is the Federal Reserve, by the FDIC, by myself and the president. And if we deem that these banks are too systemic to not be bailed out, then they will. Everyone else will not be. They will fail and be bailed in. And that's what we always thought the laws were since they were rewritten in 2009. That's what everyone believed. And that's why the majority of the people avoided the big banks that have the massive derivative exposure, like JP and Citi and Morgan Stanley and B of A and Wells Fargo, and embraced the small regional banks. Now, it's important to note that the regional banks in this country represent roughly 70% of all the small business loans in the United States. And small businesses represent traditionally up to 40% of GDP in the United States. It is the small businesses that are the backbone of this country. It's the businesses where you walk into the bank and they say, "Hey, man, how you doing? How's your kids? I'll see you at the Little League game tonight. And how's your dad doing? And how's his business doing? You know, we helped him start his company 15 years ago, and we're so glad to be working with you. And what can I do for you?" That type of customer service and relationships that are really the foundation of these small banks. And so, it's interesting because you have to wonder, is this intended? Because when she said that, ask yourself, if you own a small business in middle America and you're working with the regional bank, and you have, not only do you have $5 million of operating capital for your small trucking company, maybe you have a couple of trucks and you're hauling stuff back and forth and you have operating capital, and then you have your own account there and your kids' accounts there, and you have investment accounts there, and everything is bundled with this one bank that's been so great to your family and your community forever. And now they just got a fuse lit underneath them saying, well, if they fail, too bad. And so what you are seeing is panic ensue.
Yeah.
And these banks, I'm sure most people understand this by now, but let's just, for the sake of anyone who hasn't heard, these banks over the last decade, with interest rates at or near zero, you'd go into a bank and put it in a savings account, and you'd look at what they're paying you and you'd laugh. You'd say, my gosh, they're paying me 25 basis points, a quarter of 1% in a savings account. Well, they would take that money that you would deposit, because after the pandemic or during the pandemic, the banks were allowed to get rid of all reserve requirements, which used to be 3 or 4%, a small number, but now they got rid of it. So instead, you deposit $5,000 and they would take that $5,000 and they would go and buy US treasuries with it, or mortgage-backed securities, which are both backed by the government, right? So figure, hey, this is a conservative play, right? They're not speculating with your money. They would buy treasuries paying 2%, pay you a 0.25%, and make 8 times what they're paying you. That's how they make money and stay in business. They would buy mortgage-backed securities at 3% or 4%. They're now selling at 6 or 7%. The treasuries at 4 and 5%. And the problem is when there is a run on the banks, when people say, I don't like what I see here, and start pulling their money out, redeeming their deposits, well, they're not there. They're invested in longer maturity assets, like a 10-year treasury that has been cut in half unless it is allowed to go to maturity. At the end of 10 years, you'll get what you put into it plus your 2%. If you have to sell it now, it may be worth 40 or 50 cents on the dollar. And as we saw with Silicon Valley Bank, enough people do this, in 24 hours, the bank blows up. And that's just talking about their toxic assets, which are traditionally very conservative. That doesn't even talk about the loans and all the other things that the banks had that just blow everything up. And so what you are seeing now is a rush out of these regional banks into things like gold and silver, into the big banks, the handful of big commercial banks that are too big to fail systemically. And what she did is almost treasonous. She is literally blowing up 5,000 banks that represent the backbone of this economy, because a lot of the loans that are made for small businesses are less based upon balance sheet and business plan and more about relationship and trust, and where these small banks have the latitude to do that. Well, I know their family and I trust them, and he's got a good character about him, and I think they'll do just fine, so maybe we'll charge a little bit higher rate, but we're going to give them that loan. Well, you won't get that loan with Wells Fargo or Bank of America or whatever it may be. And not only will it create a big squeeze on the small businesses and the corollary effect of that, it's going to eviscerate the majority of every one of the banks throughout middle America that people have used forever. And this has created a fear that I can't quite explain to you. I mean, honestly, I've been working 18 hours a day for 16 days. I feel like I'm the Walking Dead. I truly do. I can't even sleep at night because I'm so wound up by 2 a.m. when I go to sleep. And I'm still 50, 75, 80, 100 emails behind and just trying to keep up. And because what you are seeing is the difference between motivation on greed and that of absolute paranoia and fear. And I think that's what we will see more and more of and this doesn't even talk about the things that I've been talking about forever outside the country that will only make what's happening here magnitudes worse. And I don't know, man, it's been the craziest 2 weeks that I could ever explain to you. And I think it's just the very beginning, because all the money that's coming out of these banks is going to create more bank failures. And it hasn't happened yet, but you see another 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, and people are going to lose their mind.
Yeah.
And you will see a rush into
not getting bailed out.
Right. And a rush into tangibles and a rush into anything, including the big 5 or 6 banks that will really reshape the way things are done in this country.